The mining ship, Stellar Harvest, moved through the darkness of space like a giant metal beast. Its hull was scratched and dented from years of work among the asteroids. Inside the ship, Captain Vextar stood on the bridge, his forearms moving across the control panels with practiced ease. His skin looked like blue crystal, and when light hit it, small rainbows danced across his tall frame. "Sir, we are approaching the target asteroid," said Krill from his station. The insect-like alien had 6 thin arms that clicked and tapped on his controls. His large compound eyes reflected the green glow of the screens. "The readings show high levels of quantum crystal deposits." Captain Vextar nodded. "Good, the colony needs these crystals badly. Without them, our ships cannot travel between the stars." He turned to look at the massive creature sitting at the mining station. "Thorn, prepare the extraction equipment." Thorn was twice the size of the others, made of what looked like living rock. When he spoke, his voice was deep and slow, like stones grinding together. "Equipment ready, Captain. This should be easy work." In the corner of the bridge, Jake Morrison sat quietly at a small workstation. He was fixing a broken scanner, his human hands moving carefully with simple tools. The aliens had rescued him 3 months ago when they found his damaged ship floating in space. He was the only human they had ever seen, and they were not sure what to make of him. Jake was average height for a human, with brown hair and green eyes. His clothes were simple work clothes, stained with oil and metal dust. He had been working on salvage ships for 10 years before his rescue. The aliens thought humans were primitive, but they kept him around because he could fix things in ways they never thought of. "Jake," Captain Vextar called out, "when you finish with that scanner, check the cargo bay equipment. We will need everything working perfectly for this operation." "Yes, sir," Jake replied, not looking up from his work. He had learned to keep his head down and do his job. The aliens were not mean to him, but they made it clear that humans were not as advanced as they were. The ship shuddered slightly as it approached the asteroid. Through the large windows, Jake could see the rocky surface getting closer. The asteroid was about the size of a small mountain, spinning slowly in the void. It was dark gray with streaks of silver running through. Scan complete," Krill announced. "The asteroid contains more quantum crystals than our initial readings showed. This could be a very profitable mining operation." Captain Vextar's crystal skin glowed brighter with excitement. "Excellent. Begin detailed scans of the interior. We need to find the best extraction points." Jake finished his work on the scanner and stood up. "I'll go check the cargo bay equipment now," he said. "Very well," the captain replied without looking at him. Jake walked through the ship's corridors. The walls were smooth and curved, with soft blue lights that followed him as he moved. Everything was designed for beings much taller than humans, so Jake had to reach up to touch most of the controls. But he had gotten used to it over the past 3 months. The cargo bay was huge, filled with mining equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. There were plasma cutters that could melt through almost anything, molecular disruptors that could break apart the bonds between atoms, and gravitational manipulators that could move objects by bending space itself. Jake walked among the machines, checking each one carefully. He had learned how to maintain the alien technology, even though he did not fully understand how it worked. His job was to make sure everything was clean, properly connected, and ready to use. As he worked, he heard excited voices from the bridge over the ship's communication system. The aliens had found something big. Jake continued his work, but he listened carefully to what they were saying. "Captain, you need to see this." Krill's voice came through the speakers. "The deep scans are showing something incredible." Jake could hear the excitement in Captain Vextar's voice. "What is it?" "There is a massive quantum crystal in the center of the asteroid. It is the largest one I have ever seen. The energy readings are off the scale." "How large?" Thorn's slow voice asked. "If I am reading this correctly, it is bigger than all the crystals we have mined in the past year combined. It could power an entire fleet of ships." Jake stopped working and looked up at the speaker. "A crystal that big would be worth a fortune. The aliens would be able to trade it for enough supplies to last their colony for years. There is one problem, Krill continued. The crystal is embedded in a very dense material. Our scans cannot identify what it is, but it appears to be much harder than normal asteroid rock. That should not be a problem, Captain Vexstar said. We have the best equipment available. Prepare for extraction. Jake went back to his work, but his mind was thinking about what he had heard. He had worked with many different types of rock and metal in his salvage career. Sometimes the hardest materials were not the ones that looked the strongest. Sometimes they just needed to be approached in the right way. An hour later, the ship docked with the asteroid. Jake could feel the slight vibration as the docking clamps locked into place. The aliens were getting ready to start their mining operation. Jake, report to the mining chamber. Captain Vexstar's voice came over the speakers. We may need maintenance support during the extraction. Jake put away his tools and walked to the mining chamber. This was a large room connected to the ship's airlock system. The aliens could extend a tunnel from the ship directly into the asteroid, allowing them to work in a pressurized environment. The mining chamber was busy with activity. Captain Vexstar was directing the operation while Krill monitored the equipment. Thorn was preparing the heavy mining tools. Jake found a spot out of the way where he could watch and be ready to help if needed. Begin the tunnel, Captain Vexstar ordered. Thorn activated a machine that looked like a giant drill. It extended from the ship and began cutting into the asteroid's surface. The drill was not like the simple metal drills that humans used. This one used focused energy beams to vaporize the rock, creating a smooth tunnel as it went deeper. Jake watched as the tunnel extended further and further into the asteroid. The screen showed their progress as they moved toward the center where the large crystal waited. The readings showed that the crystal was even bigger than they had first thought. Tunnel complete, Thorn announced. We can now access the crystal chamber. The aliens put on their environmental suits and entered the tunnel. Jake followed behind them, wearing a human-sized suit that they had made for him. The tunnel was perfectly round and smooth, with lights along the walls. They walked for about 10 minutes before reaching the end of the tunnel. Jake gasped when he saw what was waiting for them. The crystal was huge, almost as tall as a person and twice as wide. It glowed with an inner light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The light was beautiful, shifting between blue and purple and silver, but Jake also saw the problem. The crystal was completely surrounded by a dark, metallic-looking material that seemed to have grown around it like a shell. The material looked harder than anything Jake had ever seen. Magnificent, Captain Vexstar whispered. This crystal will change everything for our people. The surrounding material is definitely going to be a challenge, Krill said, running his scanner over the surface. But our equipment should be able to handle it. Jake stared at the crystal and the dark material around it. Something about it looked familiar, but he could not place what it was. He made a mental note to study it more carefully when the aliens began their work. Tomorrow we begin extraction, Captain Vexstar announced. This will be the most important mining operation in the history of our colony. As they walked back through the tunnel to the ship, Jake could not shake the feeling that this was going to be more difficult than the aliens expected. But he kept his thoughts to himself. After all, he was just a primitive human. What could he possibly know that these advanced aliens did not? The next morning, Jake woke up to the sound of heavy machinery being moved through the ship. He dressed quickly and made his way to the mining chamber. The aliens had been working since early in their day cycle, preparing their most advanced equipment for the crystal extraction. Captain Vexstar stood in the center of the chamber, his forearms gesturing as he gave orders to the crew. His crystal skin was glowing brighter than usual, showing his excitement about the operation. Today we make history, he announced to everyone present. This crystal will secure our colony's future for generations. Krill was at his control station, running final checks on all the equipment. His 6 arms moved across the panels like a pianist playing a complex song. All systems are ready, Captain. The plasma cutters are at full power, and the molecular disruptors are calibrated for maximum efficiency. Thorn was loading the heavy equipment onto transport carts. Despite his enormous size and strength, he moved with surprising gentleness around the delicate machinery. "The gravitational manipulators are ready as well," he reported in his deep, slow voice. "We have enough power to move objects 10 times heavier than that crystal." Jake found his usual spot near the wall where he could observe without getting in the way. He had brought his basic toolkit, just in case something needed repair during the operation. The aliens barely noticed him as they prepared for what they expected to be a routine, if large, extraction. "Begin transport to the crystal chamber," Captain Vexstar ordered. The team moved through the tunnel in a long line, carrying their equipment. Jake walked at the back, carrying a simple repair kit and some spare parts. The tunnel was filled with the hum of machinery and the excited chatter of the aliens. When they reached the crystal chamber, Jake got his first good look at the massive crystal in proper lighting. It was even more beautiful than he had remembered. The inner light pulsed steadily, and the colors seemed to shift and dance as he watched. But his attention was drawn to the dark material surrounding it. The material looked like it had been melted and then cooled around the crystal. It was smooth in some places and rough in others, as if it had flowed like liquid before hardening. Jake had seen similar patterns in salvage work, but never with material this hard-looking. "Set up the plasma cutters first," Captain Vexstar instructed. "We will start with a controlled burn to test the material's resistance." Krill and 2 other crew members positioned the plasma cutters around the crystal. These machines were about the size of a large desk, with multiple focusing arrays that could concentrate incredible heat into a very small area. Jake had seen them cut through the hull of a battleship like it was paper. "Beginning test cut," Krill announced. The plasma cutters hummed to life, creating beams of energy so bright that everyone had to put on protective eyewear. The beams hit the dark material around the crystal, and Jake expected to see it begin to melt immediately. Instead, something strange happened. The material absorbed the energy, glowing slightly where the beams touched it, but it did not melt or even seem to heat up very much. After several minutes of continuous cutting, there was barely a mark on the surface. "Increase power to maximum," Captain Vexstar ordered, his voice showing the first hint of concern. The plasma cutters roared louder, and the beams became so bright they were painful to look at even through the protective eyewear. But the result was the same. The material glowed brighter where the energy hit it, but it did not cut through. "This is impossible," Krill said, checking his readings. "The material should be vaporized at these temperatures. It is absorbing the energy somehow." "The molecular disruptors," Captain Vexstar said. "If heat will not work, we will attack the molecular bonds directly." The molecular disruptors were smaller machines that used a different type of energy. Instead of heat, they sent out waves that could break apart the bonds between atoms, essentially dissolving solid matter. Jake had seen them used to clear away wreckage that was too dangerous to cut with normal tools. Thorne positioned the disruptors around the crystal while Krill programmed them for maximum effect. "Ready for molecular disruption," Thorne announced. The disruptors activated with a high-pitched whine that made Jake's teeth ache. The energy waves were invisible, but Jake could feel them vibrating through the rock floor. The aliens watched their instruments carefully, waiting for signs that the material was breaking down. "No effect," Krill reported after several minutes. "The molecular structure is not changing at all. It is as if the material is immune to molecular disruption." Captain Vexstar's skin was beginning to flash with colors that Jake had learned meant frustration and anger. "How is this possible? These are the most advanced tools in the galaxy." "Perhaps we need to use more power," suggested one of the other crew members. "We could bring in the heavy industrial equipment from the ship. That equipment is designed for large-scale mining operations," Krill said. "It would destroy the crystal along with the surrounding material." Jake stepped forward slightly, clearing his throat. "Captain, may I take a closer look at the material?" Captain Vexstar turned to him with surprise. "What could you possibly see that our advanced scanners cannot detect?" "I just want to examine it with my eyes," Jake said. "Sometimes simple observation can reveal things that instruments miss." The captain waved a dismissive hand. "Very well, but do not touch anything." We cannot risk damaging the crystal. Jake walked closer to the crystal, pulling out a simple magnifying glass from his toolkit. The aliens watched him with amusement, as if a child was trying to help with adult work. Jake ignored their looks and focused on the material. Up close, he could see details that the scanners might miss. The material was not uniform. It had layers and grain patterns like wood or stone. There were tiny cracks and stress lines running through it, invisible unless you knew what to look for. Some areas looked weaker than others, as if they had been under pressure for a long time. "It has natural weak points," Jake said, more to himself than to the aliens. "What did you say?" Captain Vextar asked. "The material has natural stress patterns," Jake explained. "It is not solid all the way through. There are places where it is weaker, and if you apply force in the right direction, it might crack along those lines." Krill looked at his scanner readings. "Our instruments show no such weaknesses. The material appears to be uniformly dense throughout." "Your instruments are looking for density and composition," Jake said. "But they are not seeing the mechanical stress patterns. In my salvage work, I learned to read these patterns in damaged HULLs and structural supports." "Interesting theory," Captain Vextar said, but his tone suggested he did not believe it. "However, we will continue with proven methods. Thorn, prepare the gravitational manipulators." The gravitational manipulators were the most powerful tools they had. They could create fields that bent space itself, allowing them to move objects by manipulating gravity. Jake had seen them lift entire sections of destroyed ships, Thorn set up the manipulators around the crystal, creating a complex web of gravitational fields. "Gravitational matrix established," he reported. "Beginning extraction attempt." The manipulators hummed with power, and Jake could feel the strange sensation of gravity shifting around him. The crystal itself began to glow brighter, responding to the gravitational stress, but the dark material around it did not budge. "Increase power," Captain Vextar ordered. The gravitational fields grew stronger, and Jake felt his feet lift slightly off the ground. The crystal was pulsing rapidly now, and the light was becoming almost blinding. But still, the surrounding material held firm. "Captain," Krill called out, alarm in his voice. "The gravitational stress is causing microfractures in the crystal itself. If we continue at this power level, we risk damaging it." "Shut down the manipulators," Captain Vextar ordered immediately. The gravitational fields collapsed, and Jake felt his weight return to normal. The crystal slowly dimmed back to its normal glow, but Jake could see tiny stress lines had appeared on its surface. "We cannot risk damaging the crystal," Captain Vextar said, his frustration now obvious to everyone. "But we cannot leave it here either. The colony needs those crystals desperately." The aliens stood around the crystal, looking defeated. Their most advanced technology had failed them completely. Jake watched them discuss their options, but he was studying the material around the crystal more carefully. "Captain," Krill said quietly, "we could call for the heavy mining ship. It has equipment powerful enough to break through any material." "The nearest heavy ship is 3 weeks away," Captain Vextar replied. "We do not have enough fuel to wait that long. And even if we did, the heavy equipment would destroy the crystal along with the surrounding material." "What about using explosives?" suggested another crew member. "We could place charges around the material and blast it apart." "Too dangerous," Thorn said. "The crystal would be destroyed in the explosion." Jake continued to study the material, tracing the stress lines with his eyes. He was beginning to understand the pattern. The material was not just hard, it was designed to resist energy-based attacks. But it had been formed under natural pressure, which meant it had natural weak points where that pressure had been greatest. "Captain," Jake said again, "I really think the mechanical stress approach might work." That evening, Jake sat in his small quarters, staring at the ceiling. The aliens had spent the rest of the day in meetings, trying to figure out what to do next. He could hear their voices through the walls, discussing options that all seemed impossible. They talked about waiting for the heavy mining ship, about trying to find other crystals on the asteroid, about giving up and finding another mining site, but Jake could not stop thinking about the crystal. He had seen the stress patterns in the material. the way it was layered and cracked in certain places. In his years of salvage work, he had learned to read these patterns like a map. Metal and stone always broke in predictable ways when they were under pressure for long periods. He remembered a job he had done 5 years ago, breaking apart a crashed freighter that had been twisted by impact. The hull had been made of the strongest alloy available, but age and stress had created weak points. Jake had found those weak points and used simple leverage to split the hull apart piece by piece. The problem with the crystal was similar. The aliens were trying to overpower the material with brute force and advanced technology. But the material seemed designed to absorb and deflect that kind of attack. What it might not be able to resist was steady, mechanical pressure applied. In exactly the right places, Jake got up and walked to his small workbench. He pulled out a piece of paper and began drawing the crystal from memory. He sketched the stress lines he had seen, trying to map out where the weak points might be. The pattern was complex, but it followed natural laws of physics that he understood. As he worked, an idea began to form. He needed something long and strong that could be used as a lever, something that could apply steady pressure at precise angles. The aliens had focusing tools and precision instruments, but they were all designed for energy-based work. What he needed was something completely mechanical. Then he remembered the cargo bay. 3 weeks ago, the aliens had salvaged materials from a derelict ship they had found floating in space. Among those materials were the skeletal remains of some large creature. The bones had been incredibly dense and strong, evolved from a world with much higher gravity than Earth. Jake had been curious about the bones when they brought them aboard. He had examined them briefly and been amazed by their strength and density. The aliens had kept them because they thought they might be valuable for trade, but they were stored in a forgotten corner of the cargo bay. He made his way quietly through the ship to the cargo bay. The aliens were all in their quarters for the night cycle, so the corridors were empty. The cargo bay was dimly lit, filled with equipment and salvaged materials from various operations. Jake found the bones in a storage crate near the back of the bay. There were several pieces, but one stood out immediately. It was about 4 feet long, slightly curved, and incredibly dense. It felt like it was made of metal rather than bone. Jake lifted it carefully, testing its weight and balance. The bone was perfect. It was long enough to provide good leverage, strong enough to handle enormous pressure, and curved in a way that would help him apply force at the right angles. But it would need some modification to work as a proper pry bar. Jake spent the next hour working on the bone. He used metal strips from damaged equipment to reinforce the ends, creating a strong point for applying pressure and a comfortable grip for his hands. He wrapped the grip area with cloth to prevent slipping. The work was simple but precise, using techniques he had learned from years of making tools from salvaged materials. When he was finished, he had created a pry bar that was unlike anything the aliens had ever seen. It was not sophisticated or high-tech, but it was perfectly suited for the job he had in mind. He tested it by lifting some heavy equipment in the cargo bay, and it worked exactly as he had hoped. Jake looked at the time display on the wall. It was the middle of the night cycle, and the aliens would not wake for several hours. This was his chance to test his theory without interference. If he was wrong, he would quietly put everything back, and no one would ever know. But if he was right, he might be able to free the crystal where all the advanced technology had failed. He gathered his tools and made his way back to the mining chamber. The tunnel to the crystal chamber was dark, but Jake had brought a simple flashlight. He walked carefully through the smooth passage, carrying his improvised pry bar and a small bag of basic tools. The crystal chamber was eerily quiet after the noise and activity of the day. The crystal itself continued to pulse with its inner light, providing a soft glow that filled the space. Jake set down his tools and approached the crystal slowly. In the dim light, he could see the stress patterns even more clearly than before. The material around the crystal had natural fault lines running through it, created by millions of years of pressure and temperature changes. The alien scanners could not detect these patterns because they were looking for chemical and density differences, not mechanical stress. Jake positioned himself at what he thought was the first weak point. It was a thin crack that ran vertically along one side of the crystal's encasement. He placed the pointed end of his pry bar into the crack and tested the angle. The fit was perfect. He began to apply pressure slowly and steadily. Unlike the aliens' high-energy approaches, this was quiet work. Jake used his body weight and the leverage of the bar to create steady, constant pressure along the fault line. At first, nothing happened. The crack did not seem to widen at all, but Jake was patient. He had learned in salvage work that sometimes you had to wait for the material to respond. Pressure took time to work its way through solid matter. After 10 minutes of steady pressure, Jake heard a soft sound like a whisper. The crack had widened by just a fraction, but it was enough to encourage him. He adjusted his position and continued applying pressure. The work was physically demanding. Jake had to use his whole body to create enough force, bracing his feet against the floor and pushing with his back and shoulders. Sweat began to drip down his face, but he did not stop. Slowly, over the course of an hour, the crack began to widen. Jake could see deeper into the material now, and he realized that the fault line extended much further than he had first thought. The crack was not just surface deep, it went all the way through the material in that area. He moved to the next weak point, a horizontal crack that intersected with the first one. This one was harder to reach, requiring him to lie on his side and push upward with the pry bar. But the same patient approach worked. After another hour of steady pressure, the second crack began to widen. Jake worked methodically through the night, moving from one weak point to the next. Each crack required a different approach, a different angle of pressure. Sometimes he had to pull rather than push or twist the bar to create the right kind of stress. But his years of experience had taught him how to read the material and apply exactly the right kind of force. As the hours passed, the network of cracks began to spread through the material. Jake could see how they connected to each other, forming a web of weakness that ran through the entire structure. The aliens' tools had been trying to power through the strongest parts of the material, but Jake was working with its natural weak points. By the time he heard the first sounds of the aliens beginning their morning activities, Jake had created a network of cracks that covered almost half of the crystal's encasement. The material was still holding together, but he could see that it was much weaker than before. Jake quickly gathered his tools and headed back to the ship. He wanted to clean up and get some rest before the aliens discovered what he had been doing. But as he walked through the tunnel, he felt a sense of excitement. His approach was working. The material was responding to mechanical pressure in ways it had never responded to. Energy-based attacks. He reached his quarters just as the ship's lights came on to signal the beginning of the day cycle. Jake hid his improvised pry bar under his bed and lay down to rest. In a few hours, the aliens would return to the crystal chamber and discover the changes he had made. Jake closed his eyes and smiled. He had not solved the problem completely yet, but he had proven that his approach could work. The crystal could be freed, not through advanced technology, but through simple mechanical principles that humans had been using for thousands of years. He wondered what Captain Vexstar would say when he saw the cracks. Would he be angry that Jake had worked without permission? Or would he be impressed that the primitive human had found a way to succeed where their advanced tools had failed? Jake drifted off to sleep, dreaming of the moment when the crystal would finally be free. He had proven that sometimes the oldest solutions were the best ones. Now he just needed to finish the job. Jake woke up to the sound of excited voices echoing through the ship. He had only been asleep for 3 hours, but the noise was too loud to ignore. He could hear Captain Vexstar's voice above the others, and he sounded very upset. Someone has been in the crystal chamber without permission, the captain was saying. There are new cracks in the material that were not there yesterday. Jake sat up in his bed and listened carefully. He could hear Krill's voice responding, "The cracks appear to be spreading through the material in a controlled pattern. This is not random damage. Could it have happened naturally?" asked Thorn in his slow, deep voice. "Impossible," Captain Vexstar replied. "Someone did this deliberately. I want to know who." Jake took a deep breath and got dressed. He had known this moment would come. The aliens would discover his work eventually, and he would have to explain what he had done. He just hoped they would listen to his explanation before getting too angry. He made his way to the mining chamber, where all the aliens were gathered around the entrance to the tunnel. They were talking quickly in their own language, their voices filled with concern and confusion. When Jake appeared, they all turned to look at him. "Jake," Captain Vexstar said, his crystal skin flashing with orange colors that meant anger. "Do you know anything about what happened in the crystal chamber last night?" Jake nodded. "Yes, sir. I went there to test my theory about the stress patterns." The chamber fell silent. All the aliens stared at Jake with expressions of shock and disbelief. Captain Vexstar's skin flashed brighter orange and his forearms gestured angrily. "You went into the chamber without permission and damaged the crystal site?" the captain demanded. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" "You could have destroyed the most valuable find in our colony's history." "I did not damage anything," Jake said calmly. "I created controlled fractures along the natural weak points in the material. The crystal itself is completely safe." "Natural weak points?" Krill said, his compound eyes reflecting confusion. "Our scanners detected no such weaknesses." "Your scanners look for density and composition," Jake explained. "They do not see mechanical stress patterns. But those patterns are there, and they show exactly where the material will break if pressure is applied correctly." Captain Vexstar stepped closer to Jake, towering over him. "You're telling me that you, a primitive human with basic tools, found weaknesses that our advanced technology could not detect?" "Yes, sir," Jake said. "In my salvage work, I learned to read these patterns. They are invisible to most instruments, but visible to someone who knows what to look for." Thorn spoke up in his slow voice. "Show us these patterns you speak of." Jake looked around at the alien faces. They were still angry and suspicious, but he could see curiosity beginning to mix with their emotions. "I can show you, but we need to go to the crystal chamber." Captain Vexstar hesitated for a long moment, then he nodded. "Very well. But if you have damaged that crystal in any way, there will be serious consequences." The group made their way through the tunnel to the crystal chamber. When they reached the chamber, Jake heard several gasps of surprise. The network of cracks he had created was clearly visible in the chamber's bright lights. The cracks formed a complex web pattern across the surface of the material, but the crystal itself was untouched and glowing as brightly as ever. "How did you do this?" Krill asked, running his scanner over the cracks. "The fractures are perfectly placed to avoid any damage to the crystal." Jake pointed to the first crack he had worked on. "The material has natural fault lines that were created over millions of years. You can see them if you look carefully at the grain patterns and color variations." He moved to another crack and traced its path with his finger. "This fault line runs horizontally and connects with the vertical one. By applying pressure at the intersection point, I was able to widen both cracks at the same time." Captain Vexstar examined the cracks more closely. His skin was beginning to shift from angry orange to curious blue. "These fractures do follow a logical pattern. How did you create them?" Jake walked back to the tunnel entrance where he had left his improvised pry bar hidden behind some equipment. He pulled it out and showed it to the aliens. "I made this from one of the bones we salvaged 3 weeks ago. I reinforced it with metal strips and used it to apply mechanical pressure to the weak points." The aliens stared at the bone pry bar with amazement. It looked incredibly primitive compared to their sophisticated equipment, but the results spoke for themselves. "A bone?" Thorn said slowly. "You used a bone to accomplish what our most advanced tools could not?" "The material absorbs energy-based attacks," Jake explained. "But it cannot absorb mechanical pressure applied slowly and steadily. The key is to work with the natural stress patterns instead of fighting against them." Krill was running his scanners over the cracks, studying the readings carefully. "The fractures are weakening the overall structure," he reported. "If we continue this process, the material should eventually break apart completely." "Continue the process?" Captain Vexstar asked. "You mean use this primitive tool to finish the job?" "It is working," Jake said simply. "My calculations show that if we can create fractures along all the major fault lines, The material will split apart naturally. The crystal will be completely undamaged. Captain Vexstar looked at his crew, then back at Jake. Jake could see the captain struggling with the idea that a human's primitive methods might succeed where their advanced technology had failed. "Very well," the captain said finally. "Show us how this process works." "But I will be monitoring every step to ensure the crystal's safety." Jake nodded and picked up his pry bar. "I will need to work on that fault line next," he said, pointing to a crack that ran diagonally across the material. "But I could use some help positioning the tool correctly." Thorn stepped forward. "Tell me how to help." Jake was surprised by the big alien's willingness to assist. "I need you to hold the bar steady while I adjust the angle. The pressure has to be applied in exactly the right direction." Thorn's massive hands took hold of the pry bar while Jake positioned it in the crack. "Like this?" Thorn asked. "Perfect," Jake said. "Now I need steady pressure. Not too fast, or the crack might go in the wrong direction." Jake began to apply pressure to the bar, using Thorn's strength to amplify his own efforts. The crack began to widen almost immediately, responding much faster than it had when Jake was working alone. "It is working," Krill said excitedly, watching his instruments. "The stress is spreading through the material exactly as Jake predicted." Captain Vexstar moved closer to watch. "How long will this process take?" "If we work together, maybe 4 or 5 hours, Jake estimated. "We need to create fractures along about 6 more fault lines." "I want to help too," Krill said. "Tell me what I can do." Jake looked around at the aliens. Their attitudes had completely changed. Instead of being angry and suspicious, they were now eager to learn his methods. "Krill, you can monitor the crystal's condition and make sure we do not put too much stress on it." "Captain, you can help me plan the sequence of fractures." For the next several hours, the team worked together in the crystal chamber. Jake directed the operation, showing each alien how to read the stress patterns and apply pressure in the right places. Thorn provided the muscle power, Krill monitored the equipment, and Captain Vexstar helped plan each step. The work was slow and careful, but it was also satisfying. Each new fracture brought them closer to freeing the crystal. The aliens began to understand how Jake's approach worked, and they started suggesting improvements and variations. "The material is much weaker now," Krill reported as they worked on the 5th major fault line. "The overall structure is beginning to lose cohesion. How much more do we need to do?" Captain Vexstar asked. Jake studied the pattern of cracks they had created. "One more major fracture should do it. If we can connect this diagonal crack with the vertical one over there, the whole structure should split open." They positioned the pry bar at the intersection point Jake had identified. This was the most critical moment. If they applied too much pressure, they might damage the crystal. If they applied too little, the structure might not break completely. "Ready?" Jake asked, looking around at his alien teammates. They all nodded. Thorn gripped the bar firmly. Krill watched his instruments. And Captain Vexstar stood ready to call a halt if anything went wrong. Jake began to apply pressure slowly and steadily. The crack started to widen, and they could hear small sounds of shifting and settling as the structure began to change. The sounds grew louder, and Jake could feel vibrations through the pry bar. "The stress is building," Krill reported. "All readings are still within safe parameters." Jake increased the pressure slightly. The sounds grew louder still, and suddenly there was a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. The diagonal fracture had connected with the vertical one, creating a continuous break through the material. "That did it," Jake said, stepping back from the crystal. "Now we wait." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, the material around the crystal began to split apart. The fractures spread rapidly through the remaining structure, following the stress lines exactly as Jake had predicted. Within minutes, the dark material had broken into several large pieces that fell away from the crystal. The crystal sat free in its cavity, pulsing with light that made everyone's faces glow in shifting colors of blue and purple. The dark material that had trapped it for millions of years lay in broken pieces around the chamber floor. After days of frustration and failure, the most important discovery in the colony's history was finally within their reach. Captain Vexstar stood staring at the crystal for a long moment, his forearms hanging at his sides. His crystalline skin was shifting through colors that Jake had never seen before, colors that seemed to show deep emotion and amazement. "Jake," the captain said quietly, not taking his eyes off the crystal, "I owe you an apology. When you first suggested that mechanical pressure might work, I dismissed your ideas as primitive. I was wrong." Jake set his bone pry bar down on the chamber floor. "You were not wrong to trust your technology, Captain. Your tools are amazing, but sometimes different problems need different solutions." Krill was carefully examining the freed crystal with his scanner, his 6 arms moving in excited patterns. "The energy readings are incredible," he announced. "This crystal contains enough power to fuel our entire colony for 50 years, and Jake's method has left it completely undamaged." Thorn picked up one of the pieces of broken material that had surrounded the crystal. Despite his enormous strength, he handled it gently, turning it over in his massive hands. "This material is still incredibly hard," he said in his slow voice. "How did you know that simple pressure would work when our advanced tools could not break it?" Jake walked over to where Thorn was examining the broken piece. "In my salvage work, I learned that the hardest materials are often the most brittle. They can resist enormous amounts of energy, but they break easily if you find their weak points and apply force in the right way." "But our scanners should have detected those weak points," Krill said, his compound eyes reflecting confusion. "Your scanners are designed to find chemical and energy differences," Jake explained, "but stress patterns are mechanical. They are created by physical forces acting over long periods of time. You have to look for them with your eyes and feel for them with your hands." Captain Vexstar finally turned away from the crystal to look at Jake. "You're saying that our technology is too advanced to see simple problems?" "Not too advanced," Jake corrected. "Just focused on different kinds of problems. Your tools are perfect for energy-based mining and precise work. But this particular problem needed a mechanical solution." Krill walked over to Jake's pry bar and examined it closely. "This tool is so simple," he said with wonder in his voice. "A bone, some metal strips, and cloth. Yet it accomplished what our million-credit equipment could not." "The tool is simple," Jake agreed, "but using it correctly required understanding. How the material would respond. That understanding came from years of experience with similar problems." Captain Vexstar picked up the pry bar and tested its weight. "Would you be willing to teach us these techniques? Our mining operations encounter difficult materials regularly, and this knowledge could be very valuable." Jake smiled. "I would be happy to teach you what I know. But you should understand that these methods work best when combined with your advanced technology. I could never have freed the crystal without Thorn's strength and Krill's monitoring." "Equipment, a combination of approaches," the captain mused. "Simple mechanical techniques supported by advanced technology. This could revolutionize our mining operations." Thorn nodded slowly. "Jake showed us that strength alone is not always the answer. Sometimes patience and precision work better than force." "And observation," Krill added. "Jake saw patterns that our instruments missed because he was looking for different things." Jake felt a warm feeling of satisfaction. For the first time since his rescue, the aliens were treating him as an equal rather than a primitive curiosity. They were genuinely interested in learning from him, just as he had learned from them over the past 3 months. "We should extract the crystal and return to the ship," Captain Vexstar said. "The Colony Council will be very excited to hear about this discovery and about the new techniques we have learned." The team worked together to carefully remove the crystal from its cavity. It was heavy, requiring all of them working together to lift it safely. Jake found himself positioned right next to Captain Vexstar as they carried the crystal through the tunnel, a position of honor that would not have been offered to him just days before, back in the mining chamber they secured the crystal in a special containment field that would protect it during the journey home. Jake watched the aliens work with their sophisticated equipment, understanding now how his simple methods could complement their advanced technology. "Jake," Captain Vexstar said as they finished the securing process, "I have a proposal for you. Our colony has mining operations throughout this sector of space. We encounter difficult extraction problems regularly. Would you be interested in joining our crew permanently as a specialist consultant? Jake was surprised by the offer. You mean work with your mining teams full-time? Exactly, the captain confirmed. You would help solve problems that our normal methods cannot handle. Your salary would be equal to any other specialist on our crew. Jake looked around at the aliens who had become his friends over the past few days. Krill was nodding enthusiastically, his compound eyes bright with excitement. Thorn was watching Jake with what might have been a smile on his rocky features. I accept, Jake said, but I have one condition. I want to learn more about your technology too. If we are going to combine our methods, I need to understand how your equipment works. Of course, Captain Vexstar agreed immediately. Krill, you will be Jake's instructor in advanced mining technology. Jake, you will teach all of us your mechanical techniques. Krill's 6 arms clicked together with pleasure. I look forward to learning how humans solve problems. Your approaches are so different from ours. As they prepared to leave the asteroid, Jake took one last look around the mining chamber. His simple bone pry bar sat on a workbench, now treated with respect rather than amusement. Captain Vexstar had declared that it would be kept in the ship's workshop as a reminder that the best solutions were not always the most complicated ones. The journey back to the colony took 3 weeks, but the time passed quickly. Jake spent his days learning about alien technology from Krill, while teaching the crew about stress analysis and mechanical problem solving. He found that the aliens were eager students, asking thoughtful questions and coming up with creative ways to combine human-alien techniques. Thorn proved to be particularly good at the mechanical approaches, his enormous strength when applied, with the precision Jake taught him, could accomplish things that neither human nor alien could do alone. Krill developed new scanning techniques that could detect stress patterns by combining his instruments with human observational methods. Captain Vexstar spent hours with Jake discussing how these new combined techniques could be applied to other mining challenges. The captain's excitement about the possibilities was infectious, and Jake found himself looking forward to their future missions when they finally reached the colony. Word of their success had already spread. The massive crystal was worth more than anyone had imagined, but the story of how it was extracted was even more valuable. The colony's leadership was fascinated by the idea that simple human techniques could enhance their advanced technology. Jake was formally inducted into the Zephyrian Mining Guild as a specialist consultant, the first human ever to receive such an honor. At the ceremony, Captain Vexstar presented him with a new tool crafted by the colony's best metalworkers. It was a pry bar made from the finest materials available, but designed according to Jake's specifications and experience. This tool represents the best of both our civilizations, Captain Vexstar announced to the assembled crowd. Human ingenuity and Zephyrian craftsmanship, working together to solve problems that neither could handle alone. Jake accepted the tool with pride. It was beautiful and functional, much more sophisticated than his improvised bone version, but based on the same simple principles that had freed the crystal. As he stood before the crowd of aliens, Jake reflected on how much had changed since his rescue. He had started as a primitive human dependent on alien charity. Now he was a valued member of their society, respected for his unique skills and knowledge, but perhaps more importantly, the aliens had learned that advancement did not always mean complexity. Sometimes the oldest and simplest solutions were still the best ones, and sometimes the greatest discoveries came not from having the most advanced technology, but from knowing how to use the right tool in the right way. The bone pry bar that had started it all was now displayed in the colony's museum, with a plaque that told the story of the day a human simple solution succeeded where advanced alien technology had failed. It had become a symbol of cooperation and respect between species, proof that different approaches to problems could work together to achieve what neither could accomplish alone. Jake kept his new pry bar in his quarters aboard the Stellar Harvest, ready for the next impossible extraction problem. He had found his place in the galaxy not by trying to match alien technology,